Fine. I see you placed your book any place you could. I mean, I can participate, so don't need to. I don't know if I think a couple of people will probably join again, but let's start and thank you very much for having accepted our invitation to this session, this shortcut session, which we introduced some time ago, only some weeks ago, to exactly allow authors and very brilliant people to briefly present their ideas, their new books, papers, whatever, big ideas. And for you, it's book and big idea together. So we're very happy to have you here. And if you don't know if you follow German politics closely, probably not, but maybe you've seen some of the pictures that we had over the weekend from people demonstrating in front of the Reichstag, and very strange thing and very strange people, a lot of people from very different angles, who whatever, anti-vaccines and extreme right people and a lot of others who don't probably usually demonstrate together. And it seems as if one thing unified them, which is angriness. And it seems that in any way they were angry about anything, whatever. So it's very good that you just published the book to allow us to better understand what happened over the weekend. And it's sure not this weekend, but it was a very strange demonstration of this very current phenomena of angriness of people who are very different. And I would like to come back to this German event, maybe in the discussion. Maybe you can help, because you, in your book, try to differentiate between mainly two sorts of anger, and maybe would be a nice exercise to go through the people who are demonstrating over the weekend and see who is on the one side, on the other side. Maybe most of them were on the more negative side. But I'm very happy to have you here and to introduce us to your thoughts on Angrynomics and your book. And don't know exactly who wants to start. But when so
all right. So I give a little intro to how the book came about. Then Eric starts talking about anger, and then we'll take it from there. And we'll try and keep all of our comments to about 15 minutes, and then we can just have a chat from there. How's that? Yeah?
Sounds good.
Yeah. Okay, let's do it. So the book came about because Eric and I were hanging out together at finance types conferences. There's a reason that I was doing that, which was the research for the last book on austerity. I needed to meet Bond vigilantes, and I met one, and his name's Eric. I discovered that they're not really vigilantes, and they don't really care about the things that you read about in the press. In fact, they're quite heterogeneous in their preferences. And eventually we got stuck on lots of panels together, and people said, you guys have a knack for explaining very complex things quite simply, so maybe you should write something together. So we got together in London, and way back in 2017, in fact, and we did some reading in advance on different topics we were interested in: automation and robots and AI, intergenerational transfers and aging, the effect of aging on the economy, big financial crashes and right and left wing violence, etc., etc. And then we got together in London and we had a chat, and we literally spoke the book, which is how the dialogue format came about. And we then got Siri to translate this, or rather transcribe this. And with a Scottish accent and an Irish accent, you can imagine the punctuation was a bit crazy, to say the least. But when we got it into normal text, it was truly awful. It sounded exactly like every other diagnostic economics text out there. Two self-serving, quite well-off white men telling the world how it works and what they should do. Whereas when we had it in the dialogue format, it allowed disagreement. So we flipped it back into the dialogue format and went back through it and pushed those areas of contrast and disagreement as much as we could, while still trying to maintain a coherent narrative. So what is the coherent narrative? The anger is the signal that basically anger should be listened to. The anger is not a bug, it's a feature of a system which is endogenously unstable and has become skewed in a whole variety of different ways, not just income and wealth, towards smaller and smaller parts of the population across the OECD countries. The leading edge of this is, of course, the Anglo countries, but we see these pathologies everywhere, and we can expect an angry response going forward. And that's basically what we came to. So, Eric, why don't you tell us about anger?
Thanks, Mark. And thanks for everybody at the Forum for New Economy for inviting us to talk about the book. We really appreciate it. Yeah, so I can remember very clearly, actually. So, so Mark and I had developed over the years a kind of shared perspective of what we thought was going on in the world of political economy. And at a certain point, Mark, whilst we were writing the book, we were probably about a third of the way through, and Mark said, "Can we say anything about anger?" And I remember it very clearly because at one level it was quite disorienting as a remark, because suddenly we have to say something about anger because people are talking about anger. We see anger everywhere. And yet I, for one, felt very, very inarticulate when it came to the subject of anger. So I had no real theory of anger, no understanding of anger. I was just relying on a purely intuitive sense of what it meant that I'd learned as a human being. And the more we started to reflect on it and read about it, the more interesting the subject became, because it is something that I think is universally recognized by humans. Children experience anger and rage. So everybody, literally everybody knows what it is, and yet it's very, very poorly understood. So we don't have a natural typology. So if I said to you, what are the different types of anger? Most people don't really know there are different types of anger, whether anger is good or bad. And part of the problem, at an intellectual level, is that the literature on anger is very diverse. So we were aware, or Marc was aware, there's been a lot of research in political science about people being more likely to vote if they were angry. I was sort of marginally aware of some moral philosophy on anger, which is largely about people doing the right or the wrong thing, and how whether it's an appropriate response to that. And then we discovered there's neuroscience, there's social psychology, there's self-help books on anger management. There's stuff on road rage. How does all of this, and then suddenly you go, well, you lose control of the subject because it's so vast. So was there any way of making it tractable, and was there anything common across these disciplines? And so we came up with a typology that we found really helpful, which was essentially there are kind of two dimensions of anger. The first dimension is the difference between public and private anger. And this is really interesting. So public and private anger are almost opposites. So typically in our private lives, anger is associated with shame. So if you had a colleague at work who was getting angry, you're more all of a sudden, you probably take them to one side and say, is everything okay at home? You seem to be very stressed, right? So that sort of anger is telling you about some kind of an internal stress of which it's a symptom. Now, if you then go to the other extreme, an example of public anger, say an Extinction Rebellion protester, you want to be quite careful taking them to one side and saying, is everything okay at home, right? Because they're more likely to punch you. They certainly say you should be angry as well. And they'll actually give you very coherent reasons as to why they're angry. There is almost a moral authority. And that was the first side. So the first distinction is between public and private. And this is reflected in the book in a kind of macro typology and a micro analysis. In the macro public anger, we then also discovered really that there appear to be two types, one of which is the dominant type in the literature, which is moral outrage, which is what most of the examples we see of anger, whether it's Extinction Rebellion, whether it's Occupy Wall Street, whether it's all of those forms of the sense of an injustice. In the book, we describe the response in Iceland to the Panama Papers. These kinds of forms of observance of an injustice. Black Lives Matter is a prime example of that in response to police brutality, right? If you see police brutality on your screen, you have this kind of sense of this is unacceptable, this is intolerant. Intolerable ethically. That's one face, the face of the anger of angels. Now then the other type of public anger that we discovered, I think, is more original because it's not specifically pinpointed in the literature. There's identification of something similar, but it's not very well articulated if you look at the literature on anger. And this came to us because we did a big data search of news stories. And we got a data system, Watson Analytics, the IBM system, to categorize different stories by anger. And the second most frequent type of story referred to angry sports fans, which in of itself is kind of intriguing. I mean, first of all, it's sort of obvious, so you sort of wonder why you bother doing any analysis to conclude it. But it's also slightly perplexing. So why do sports fans get angry? Why is it that typically men pay good money very often to watch really quite low quality sports games in inclement weather just to get angry, and they pay good money for it? This is really intriguing phenomena. And the more Marc and I thought about this, the more we thought there's something really interesting going on here, if you think of the function that this anger is serving. And we came to the conclusion that it's actually a form of identity regulator. And you can understand it if you think of tribalism or identity, extreme identification as a precursor to violence under scarce resources, if I talk a bit like an economist. Now then, you don't want to be the soldier in the front line. So there's a collective action problem. So we have these identity regulators, and anger is a kind of credible threat, because anger is a loss of temper. And it says, if you don't support the side with sufficient conviction, there'll be punishment, there'll be retribution. So this is very interesting. So we see anger in its public form as actually a way of addressing collective action problems. One is tribal, this tribal rage, which hasn't really, I don't think, been identified as clearly in the literature. And the other one is this concept of moral outrage, or a response to an injustice. So we have this public versus private, which is a very important distinction. And then we have these two forms of public anger. Now, once you have this typology, we suddenly realized our analysis of political economy made an awful lot more sense, because we had an arc, a lens to kind of categorize these different forms of responses. And so we want to try and discern the kind of legitimate anger. Where are there legitimate resonance? And then where is there this kind of dangerous tribal rage, and what could its function be?
So just to pick up on that for a second, to give an empirical example of the current moment. If you think about Trump's campaign in 2016, what he would do is go up to the Rust Belt, where the Democrats assumed that they were going to win, just like the so-called red wall that used to exist in Britain, which has been taken over by the Conservatives. And he basically went and identified with their grievances and says, yes, trade has screwed you. Yes, your corporations left you for China. Yes, you've been down in the dumps, and the Democrats have done nothing about it. In fact, they only care about Wall Street. And that made a huge amount of sense to a coalition that was waiting to be picked up. And this is the voice of public anger and legitimate moral grievance. Whether it's legitimate in an empirical sense, put that to one side, they believe it to be true. He then simultaneously goes straight down to Arizona and Texas and starts calling everyone who's coming from Mexico a rapist and a murderer, thereby playing pure race identity politics. Jump forward to where we are now, and you see something very interesting in what he's doing in his strategy of the moment. He has decided that he is the president of Red America. Blue America is a foreign country with foreign values. He only appeals to that base because he's basically betting that just by doing tribal identity modification, he can actually split enough people off the Democratic court to win. So you can see how these two things get played out in electoral politics all of the time. One of the things we also wanted to stress, though, was that because the right captures so much attention, because the right is repellent in many ways through its racism, homophobia, etc., you forget that there's a left-wing version of this. And that left-wing version empowers millions of people, whether it was in its brief moment Corbynism, whether it was Syriza in Greece, whether it is the continuation of that with Podemos and government in Spain, whether it's Bernie Sanders. There is also a bunch of angry lefties out there who feel that they have legitimate grievances and yet no formal representation in political parties. So that's how we sort of focus on this, not treating populism as some kind of sui generis phenomena, but basically as the expressions of anger coming from these more fundamental forces. You want to jump in now, Eric, or will I just quickly do through the macro, you do the micro? How do you want to go?
That's fine. No, you carry on, Marc. Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, I'm trying to keep to the 15 minutes. So once we've done that, we break out the book into kind of macro Angrynomics and micro Angrynomics. And macro Angrynomics basically says giant financial crashes tend to cause a huge amount of anger, because obviously people lose asset values depending on who is insured. And what has been increasingly apparent over the past 30 years as financial crises have grown once again in frequency and magnitude is that essentially asset holders don't make any losses. They're insured by the central bank, amongst other things. And essentially, they get bailed out, and then the costs are put on the 80% of the population that don't have such forms of asset insurance, whether it's through benign neglect in the American case, or whether it's through formal austerity in some parts of the European case a decade ago. That's going to build a lot of anger. And historically, if you look at what happened basically before the Great Depression, coming after World War I, if you then look at what happens in the 1970s in the period of inflation and labor unrest, you see that basically you have these moments of anger. And the way that we talk about this, to give people a simple way to think about this, is hardware and software in a computer. Now, very briefly, if we think that varieties of capitalism are akin to varieties of motherboards in computers, they're essentially similar, but they're quite different. Germany has a capital market which is very, very small in proportion to the American one. A lot of German firms do not list on bourses, whereas practically every American corporation's goal is to get listed in an IPO and then take the exit and run. So you both have capital markets, but they form very different things. Similar with labor markets regulations. So that's the hardware. At any given moment in time, you have software, which are economic ideas, which are basically what makes that hardware work. Over time, bugs creep up in the software endogenously, and financial fragility comes in endogenously and weakens the model and makes it very susceptible to shocks. In the 1930s, there was a huge crash, and in the 1940s, there was a system rebuild and a software reset. In the 1970s, if you think about central bank independence and moves against inflation and towards price stability, culminating in the ECB, what you end up with is a very large hardware modification and a rewriting of the software towards what you could variously call neoliberalism or modern neoclassical theory. What do you have in 2008? A giant bailout, no hardware reset and no software modification, just tons of liquidity to get the OS back up and running again. None of the underlying pathology has been addressed. That's a vol suppressant, and all vol suppressants eventually crack, particularly if they induce anger. So that's kind of the macro story. Eric will now tell us the micro story. You're off, Eric, you're off, you're muted.
Apologies. Yeah, so Marc has described an observation, which I guess ultimately is the response of anger is significantly moral outrage, or kind of observing an injustice. In a sense, you can see these crashes in the capitalist system as revealing fundamental inequities or injustices or severe costs that are associated with the system, for which understandably, reasonably, the public wants to see some sort of response or redress. And as he said, we haven't really, so in the book, we effectively address three kind of fundamental legitimate concerns that are out there. One is about the human detriment caused by recessions. So as we all know, as economists, political economists, recessions are a huge source of human suffering, and we're witnessing that again. So the first sort of challenge, we think, for a kind of new political economy that can readdress the system is that we tackle recessions. The other one is environmental degradation. Again, we kind of view these as self-evident truths, right? We think there is very, very significant and overwhelming support for these as ethical questions that need to be addressed. And the final one is wealth inequality. And in a sense, the failure of the political system is that no political party has generated credible policies on a reasonable time horizon that are going to address these three problems. We're still operating with central banks as they were designed, frankly, in the 1700s, with asset purchases and an interest rate. The system hasn't evolved. We're making it up as we go along every time there's a recession, and broadly speaking, the poorest and weakest in our societies are suffering. We have a situation where 90% of our assets are owned by as little as 1% of the population. Surely and clearly we can do better than that. That is not a high functioning capitalist or free market system. And the timescales and the nature of the ambition on the environment are severely lacking. And so in the book, one of the key proposals is that we try to address that. There's another dimension, which is this kind of micro Angrynomics, which I think is also very interesting And funnily enough, in many ways, so far in a lot of our coverage of the book has picked up a lot less attention. But really what we're observing is that, and this is kind of, it is fundamentally a criticism of economics. You know, I started out as a labor economist. And when you do labor economics, you know, as anyone else here or listening will know, you know, you think of something like the labor market. We go, well, structural reform, deregulating the labor market. Yeah, that's a good thing because you improve the trade-off between inflation and unemployment. It's as simple as that. And then you get lower rates of unemployment. That's got to be a good thing. We never stopped and said, what does that do to human beings' daily lives? Right? So yeah, you might have improved the trade-off between unemployment and inflation, but what does it mean as a human being to live in a society where there is profound uncertainty about whether you'll have a job, whether your skills are valued, whether your social network is stable, whether you can stay and live in the same community, town, city, etc. And what we're really observing is that a lot of the underlying microeconomic change has actually dramatically increased uncertainty in people's daily lives. So there's this, and this is most severe when we think about technology. We all at an intellectual level recognize technological progress is fantastically good. It improves health outcomes. It increases life expectancy. But at another level, we hate technology because technology makes our skills redundant. It creates, you know, social media. We appear to have, if you look at mental health amongst adolescents, I mean, there is actually a pandemic going on there. We have all of these side effects of technology, many of which are about creating uncertainty in our lives that actually cause us a very profound level of distress. So the policies that we've tried to think about, or as Marc should talk about this as well, the rearrangement of the furniture in our societies is really to address these four questions. So if we're going to live with the potential economic benefits of higher uncertainty in our lives, can we provide more innovative forms of insurance by rearranging the furniture? Can we create a politics where people care sufficiently about the kinds of ideas that our politicians are putting forward to address the impact of recession, to genuinely tackle inequality, not just with words, but actually to provide a means whereby people gain access to asset ownership, and where there are serious win-win positive sum solutions with respect to the future of the planet. And can we make these sufficiently motivating? That for us is the kind of challenge for enlightened politics.
It's 24 past the hour. We've been at it for 17 minutes. I think we should stop there and just have a chat.
Thanks a lot for both of you. Very exciting, very inspiring, and thoughtful to think about what kind of anger people are feeling and why and so on. Maybe I don't completely already get the difference between the public and the private and the two public forms, because thinking about these people going to the street and there are a lot of very different motivations, and some of them would say, well, it's something we are fighting for, something real, like whatever, against corona measures, whatever. So where's the common point, or what's the difference between the two? I mean, is there a good one and a bad one, or how to distinguish?
There may be a problem in sampling that one demonstration. I mean, so what was the 40,000 people or thereabouts? Let's say it was 80, right? That's still what, 1/10,000th of the population of the country. And of course you will get the freaks and geeks, right? So they're definitely in there. And you got the conspiracy theorists, because as the internet produces homologous communities, people believe crazy things because they only talk to each other, right? But another part of this, and I think this is a very fascinating one that was in the Euro Intelligence newsletter this morning, is this possibly just fatigue from the endless politics of a grand coalition where nothing happens except management? That people are actually dying for someone to take initiative and leadership and actually change the discourse and change the politics of the moment, rather than we'll swap from one Merkel-like character to another Merkel-like character with endless management and no imagination and no real thought for the future. That could also be going on there. I don't know. But I think, 40,000 people storming the steps is pretty scary. But, you know, it's a large country. So, you know, let's not overgeneralize from that.
No. I didn't want to just take them as an example because that's...
Well, Thomas, maybe I could point to some other thoughts that I don't know if they're relevant or not, but they're explored in the book. Because particularly the concept of a moral, an ethical form of anger is actually quite subtle, and it has many forms. And you'll be familiar with the moral philosopher Jürgen Habermas, and it's actually quite relevant to this because Habermas's perspective on ethics is that it's cognitive. So in the sense that people don't just don't have arbitrary ethical views, which is very different to saying they don't disagree. But the nature of their disagreement is very coherent. And one of the reasons, of course, he puts communication at the heart of ethics is because, and indeed in his kind of Kantian universalism, believes that everybody who's affected should have a voice. That's a very important ethical principle. And one of the big themes in the book is that large segments of our society feel voiceless and not represented. Now, if I was to kind of, I mean, this is a slightly, the philosophers will get cross with me. But if I combine the kind of Aristotle with Habermas, you should then expect to get that response, right? Aristotle is the originator of this idea of an appropriate anger, which is when you witness injustice, you are supposed to get angry. He actually thinks that that is a good reaction. That means you have a moral compass. And to some extent, the voicelessness of large parts of our society, the fact that people will believe in conspiracy theories, I think that may be something which is going on. So that's a very, very important part of the moral outrage. The other thing, and I think it's worth clarifying this because people get confused by this, just because we say that one form of anger is tribal and the other form is moral, doesn't mean the moral outrage is correct, right? I mean, they could be outraged. I could be ethically motivated, but completely wrong, right? Because I could be acting on falsehoods and misinformation. So I might perceive there to be an injustice simply because I don't understand it, right? So this is, after all, a very, very, it's a reflex, it's an instinct. It is not necessarily very well calibrated. So, but I have to say, I suspect if you heard the explanations that were being given, you will find them fitting into these categories. So the people who are angry will either refer to some kind of identity reference, or they will have some sense of perceived wrongdoing. Those are typically what one observes. And the more it's ethically motivated, the more cognitive. So Extinction Rebellion protester will give you very coherent reasons for their outrage. As Marc alluded to, when it becomes red versus blue, if you go to a football match and you stop the angry fan, and he doesn't give you reasons, right? You're either on his side or he wants to take you down, okay? But the Extinction Rebellion protester gives you good reasons. You can actually have an argument. And they'll say you should be angry too, right? The tribalist doesn't do that. The tribalism, I'm afraid, is a precursor to violence. It's an extinction strategy. It's kill the other, right? That's where tribalism ends. But the moral outrage has a common ground, right? There is at least a shared process of reasoning, even if people can disagree violently.
Yeah, but fundamentally, your thought is your thing is that both have the same original angriness, but just then get very different forms of it, like moral outrage or tribalism.
Or well, put it this way: you need to have material harm or perceived material harm occur to you. The one thing that we found in the more serious and well done social science accounts of populism that looks at micro level data is it's not the level of income that matters. It's the fact that any given level of income in decline for an extended period of time is where you find the clusters of support. So it's not the absolute level, it's the delta. Everything's in the delta. And if you think about that almost as a kind of relative deprivation problem, particularly in a hyper-mediated world where we all know what the Kardashians are wearing and we know how much an apartment costs in New York and it now costs $80,000 a year to attend my university, and the income that they're working really hard for is $30,000 a year, then you're just building into this a bunch of repressed anger. And then it's just a question of exactly how that anger comes out. And we used to have trade unions that would be able to articulate how that's happening and what we should do with it. We used to have political parties that were functioning organizations with organic connections into communities. We used to have churches, which also did this. And as all of those things have fragmented, then you see both the rise of conspiracy theory and also this, if you will, hyper-volatilism that comes out with these moments of anger, far in excess of possibly in many cases the injustice done. But again, if you go to the Midwest of the United States, you just need to drive from a local airport in somewhere like Milwaukee or Wisconsin and drive to the city. And honestly, the roads in East Germany were better. I know, I drove them, right? These are places that have been fiscally cauterized and are run by people who have only one goal: I want another tax cut. And rather than recognizing that as the problem, because there's no way to articulate this, it gets spilled out into lots of other ways, both cultural and political.
Yeah. If there are any questions, please raise your hands or make...
We'll just jump in. There's only 10 of us.
Yeah. So, but always good to know who's... Yeah, Martin Helwig.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for your presentation. I think it's extremely interesting and extremely pertinent. I'm wondering, though, whether the macro side is not too specialized in the sense that, first of all, I didn't hear the word globalization. And if I think about the Rust Belt, if I think about the leather industry in the Veneto, and the deindustrialization that has come about over the past 50 years in those areas. And by Rust Belt, I don't just mean the Rust Belt in the US, I mean the Rust Belt in Northern England and Wales, I mean the Rust Belt in France and Belgium, in Germany. Actually, the German one is interesting because in Germany, the anger is not so much in the Rust Belt of the Ruhr and the Saar, much more in the Neue Länder, but the logic is the same. The pattern, I think, is similar, but yet different. And what's different is that here, we're not talking about people being angry at bankers in Frankfurt making so and so much per year, but we're talking about people being angry because the very foundations of their lives have been removed. And this isn't just a recession, because there is no hope of an upswing. And their lives are completely out of control. And some of this, my life not being subject to my own control, is what we see in angers about Corona, in anger about Mrs. Merkel bringing in the refugees. Whether these decisions affect me immediately, whether they're serious or not, it's a resentment against anger, basically a perception that there are powers out there that try to do me in.
Yeah.
A final comment. A key feature of all this is a loss of the ability to have rational discourse. Discourse itself is perceived as an instrument of domination by the elites. And therefore, I mean, you were referring to Habermas and Kant before. Any notions that we have about rules of discourse, assessment of truth, assessment of method, either logical or empirical, is gone. But that's, I think, a very important dimension of the anger that you were talking about.
Thank you for that, Mark. I think it's absolutely right. The way that we ended up focusing on finance and using the metaphor of the computer and the hardware and the software was we were deliberately trying not to write a book for our community. We were really trying to write a book as a dialogue for other people who perhaps don't have these sort of backgrounds. Whenever you talk to my colleagues over here about globalization, they'll immediately start talking about David Otter's work on one side, and then there's this work on the other side, and really most of it's actually deindustrialization because of technology. And suddenly the import of what you said is lost. That this goes down to a loss of control. Right, that is what's driving this. And actually, we didn't really talk about it because we're being brief, but we actually extensively talk about this in the 4th chapter in Angrynomics. Eric alluded to it as a sense of increased uncertainty. You could also talk about it as a shift in risk away from institutions which support risk taking and are shock absorbers directly onto people in the form of contracts, in the form of work exposures, etc. All of that is there. And as for globalization itself, I mean, another one that you said there is exactly the perception of this. That is to say, it may be the case that on average, globalization has enriched the world, the famous elephant chart, but we know that there is the dip. And that perception is localized in very specific communities about how they have been hurt by this. Now, to go back to our angry frame, that can either be recognized as legitimate moral grievance that says it is outrageous that bankers earn 300 times that of workers. We should do something about that. Or it can be weaponized as foreigners are taking our jobs and we need to become more autarkic across the board. And that's where the importance of politics comes in, exactly in how you respond to those two things. Eric, you'll mute it again.
I'm not very good at this. Yeah, I mean, Martin, what you said resonates very strongly with me, as Mark has said. I do want to, though, just plant a seed of optimism in here on 2 dimensions. So I think whilst there is a trend towards neo-nationalism, which Mark sort of described as the era of neo-nationalism post the era of neoliberalism. And I do think we are in an era of neo-nationalism. I still think there is a counter trend, which is immensely powerful. And it does center around these 3 dimensions, which is, I think there is now widespread recognition of the problem of wealth inequality and income inequality. There is widespread recognition of the environmental dangers that we face. And I think there is a kind of openness and a sort of self-evident truth about wanting to combat recessions. And arguably, we've had one of the most, probably the most successful global fiscal intervention in human history, I would say. And I don't think that's an exaggeration. And I also think those 3 axes have a rational basis. They have an empirical, reasonable basis to them. So there is a ground to be fought, which is based on ethical motivations with hard facts and reason and overwhelming logic. And I don't think one should give up on that. That's my first point. My second point is that we have also got an extraordinary gift. And this is one of the themes in the book, that in many ways we are the luckiest generation. I mean that all of us. Because we have this huge problem, or we have this huge challenge. It's not a problem. We have this huge challenge, which is that we need to entirely restructure the capital bases of our economies to make our growth sustainable. Okay. Now, why is that a huge opportunity? Because we simultaneously have negative real interest rates across the globe. So every significant sovereign can finance itself for 20 or 30 years at a negative real return. That is an absolute gift, because that means you can do any investment spending you want. As long as it has a merely positive expected return, you actually strengthen the state's balance sheet. And this is something we've really, really been pushing upon, and I think something that is gathering momentum, and to some extent is already evidenced. So the optimism that I have, and I hope comes through ultimately in the book, is these 2 components, which is there is a powerfully motivating set of beliefs that can combat nationalism. And it's along on these 3 fundamentally profound issues. And secondly, we are gifted with an opportunity to actually finance the means to address those challenges.
I think Catherine had her hand up, correct?
Yes.
Yes, there we go, Catherine. Hi there.
Hi, thank you for this. It's incredibly interesting, and I just wanted to throw one thing in the mix, which is that in terms of the distinction between the tribalism and the moral outrage. I mean, this is something that I've been sort of, trying to wrestle with for years in terms of looking at these various movements, as you say, the angry lefties, the angry rightists, et cetera, et cetera. And I have this strange suspicion that, it's all fueled by a sense of injustice. And so that on both, across this divide, which I can understand the existence of this divide, but I have a suspicion that it is all fueled by a sense of injustice, whether that injustice is actually real or, legitimate, et cetera, I still suspect that it's there. And I wonder whether, the difference that you're pointing to has to do with how easy it is to find a culprit, in the various situations. So a lot of some of the psychological literature, which isn't my background, but is nevertheless interesting, argues that if you can easily identify a culprit, your sense of outrage turns to anger, whereas if you can't, your sense of outrage turns to fear. And I just wonder whether, in fact, we have really a sense of injustice on both sides. It's just that it's easier to identify Chinese steel imports, and therefore blame them. And, when you can't quite do that, then it's much easier to manipulate the diffuse sense really into fear and into fear of the other.
If I can go for that, I think that's absolutely right. And I'll try and give a quick example that speaks to what Martin was already talking about in this one. People don't understand what globalization is, but they do understand the notion that we used to make stuff here and now they make it over there, and I buy it in Walmart and I'm getting paid 40% what I did 10 years ago. They can make that triangle. One of the reasons that finance doesn't get blamed is because it's so opaque. Actually understanding how the plumbing works, what these instruments are, what leverage is, how it is possible to make money from money, that's hard. So it is harder to basically turn that into something. The virus is a wonderful example of this. We fear the virus, but we can weaponize it against China, as Trump would say. So I think that that's exactly a huge part of what's going on, and is actually a very useful addendum, if you will, to the way that we've been thinking about it, in the sense that if you can make it concrete, then it becomes anger. If you can't, it becomes fear, and fear can be weaponized in a sense. So that's just very helpful. It's a really nice way of thinking about it. I think that's absolutely right.
And I think it goes to your point about institutions as well, right? Because the institutions, be they trade unions, be they, the political parties, be they the churches, are the ones that can channel this and actually, make sure that, the blame gets legitimately and rightly apportioned, right? As opposed to kind of firing in all directions and, misdirected, toward Mexicans type thing.
But that also gives us a great insight on why it's so important for certain factions to delegitimate elite knowledge. Because elite knowledge is the guardrails. So if you can basically bust through the guardrails, then I can get to define this in any way I like to my ends. And that's the pure weaponization.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Very interesting. Andrew, you had
Yeah, thanks. So thanks very much, Thomas, and thanks very much to the authors. Looks like a really book that needs to be on my bedside table very soon. Yeah, and you've taken on a very sort of, in a sense, very topic that's very amorphous on the one hand, and very important on the other. I think maybe a way into the debate, or for me, is that maybe I can pick up what Martin Helvig said. I mean, this feeling of loss of control. I mean, it's probably worth reminding everybody that this "take back control" was the slogan of the Brexiteers, right? And that, I think, was one reason why they were in the end successful, right? They recognized, they tapped into this feeling that people had lost control, and they promised, erroneously, of course, that they would give people back control, you know, by virtue of leaving the EU. And I think that's a way maybe to think about these things. I like very much the way I think Eric, it was, you know, try to frame this in terms of this trilemma between growth and employment, or avoiding a recession was with your words, Eric, but let's call it growth and employment, maybe the environment and inequality. And I think that's right, that the mainstream parties or the progressive parties have not really found an effective solution to the trade-offs involved in that. And essentially what, you know, the example of the Brexiteers showed, and also what Trump and other populists have showed, is, you know, they don't have solutions either, right? But they're much more open about saying, you know, what people on the left may be reluctant to say is, again, something Marc said at the beginning, you're right to be angry about this stuff, right? And they, you know, they're tapping into this anger without offering solutions. I mean, maybe there's some hope in that. You know, people say that in Germany people are getting sick of the AfD, for example, because there's only so long you can go on, you know, tapping into the anger without coming up with solutions of your own, right? So there maybe some of these movements have a bit of a short half-life. That may be one reason to be optimistic. But of course, if Trump wins a second term, then that theory will be destroyed. I mean, on the scope for the progressive parties to find solutions, it seems to me, for a long time we thought there was this big trade-off between fighting inequality and getting decent growth and employment, right? I think there the debate has moved on a lot, and I think that's not such a problem now for the left to argue that we can have you know, redistribution and still have growth, and maybe even we need to have redistribution to have decent growth, right? So I think that's lesser of a problem. I think where we really all groping around in the dark, despite what Eric rightly said about real interest rates and stuff, is the growth environment trade-off, right? That I don't think it's irresolvable. I know Thomas is doing a lot on this in this area, but we have to be that's very difficult, right? And part of the anger, I think, with traditional, let's say, working class supporters of left-wing parties is they don't like the discourse of maybe people like ourselves, more middle class or better off leftist people, maybe people like the Extinction, what are they called, rebellion people, you know, who prioritize the environmental aspect, right? And the working class left people you know, sort of say, well, that's, you know, to my disadvantage, and you can maybe afford to, you know, buy a Tesla and eat vegan food, but, you know, all, you know, you're familiar with this debate. I think there we really have a lot of difficulty in putting together an alliance that pulls both these traditionally allied groups, you know, to get them back in the same boat, back in the same vehicle, electoral vehicle, political vehicle, to have a progressive agenda. So,
can I just make a couple of points? I mean, thank you, Andrew. That's very interesting what you say. One thing that is worth reflecting on, the framing in terms of right or left or progressive, liberal, these are effectively tribal connotations, right? And so what it reveals is that our propensity to form groups and then form tribes is, we don't even realize we're doing it. It's that natural. So I actually think the distinctions that we've made are very important to hang on to. The fact that our application of them is quite fluid doesn't mean they're not distinct phenomena. Now, let me give you a concrete example of what I mean. If you take the Brexit campaign, and this, the other thing I think is really important to focus on here, which you alluded to, Andrew, in your observations, is what the tribalists have, and I mean left-wing or right-wing tribalists, because I don't actually know in economics where a lot of these tribalists are, but where the populist tribalists, they have a very, very clear electoral strategy, right? It's a brutal electoral strategy. And if you want to hear the electoral strategy, or at least 2/3 of it, you can listen to Dominic Cummings on YouTube. He gave a talk at the IPPR when he'd left government. And he was explaining after Brexit how he'd campaigned, and he exploited exactly what we're discussing here. He said he uses behavioral psychology and says he actually wanted to call it take back control because people don't like the sense of loss of control and loss of certainty and uncertainty in their lives, right? I mean, he's read his Kahneman. take back control. He didn't really talk about exploiting tribalism and nationalism. It was very clear, though, that he left that to Farage, because Farage absolutely, and I listened to the debates, he went after the naked nationalism, tribalism, alluding to, you know, AIDS patients on the NHS. It was immediately a nod and a wink to absolutely plain vanilla racist tribalism. But you also had a very strong, and Cummings talks about this, you had an ethical argument within Brexit, which was largely a legacy of the Euro crisis, right? I mean, there were a lot of people absolutely legitimately arguing about how the entire Euro crisis was a travesty of a hijacking of democracy by austerity motivated elites who are completely out of touch, right? That's an ethical argument. So Brexit, but the key point though is that his campaign manipulated those three components in a brutally targeted fashion. This is why I think it's very important to keep them as distinct, right? And one of the things we talk about in the book is from social psychology. There's a theorem called the minimal groups theorem, which has now been reinforced by neuroscience. And as Marc sort of alluded to it, if you want people to form groups, they don't have to be different. You just literally say, you are group X and you are group Y, and it changes the way our brains function, right? We want to be left, right, liberal, illiberal, conservative. We have a phenomenal desire to categorize ourselves by groups. And you know, listen to what Orban is saying. Orban is saying, the reason I don't believe in free market liberal economics and democracy is because I won't win, right? He's saying, if I am illiberal, nationalistic, anti-European, interventionist, I will win. Now, he may also be doing something for real wages. I mean, he's delivered pretty good economic outcomes for a lot of Hungarians. So what we're saying is, let's get rid, we got to move beyond left and right. We've got to go to the, and to your point, if you take the issue of the environment, you've got to say, this is going to bring the industrial base back. It's got to mean I'm going to have regional regeneration. I'm going to have capital goods. I'm going to have much higher quality jobs. We're going to do much more R&D. You know, we have to translate and transform these challenges into a much broader base of support that cuts across our instinct, which is to have all of these group divisions and identities which just sort of splinter effortlessly, as we're seeing with the Democrats kind of destroying themselves in America by splintering into groups. But these are distinct phenomena, and one has to be focused on that.
Thanks, Eric. I think that sounds really exciting. That's a little bit what we try to do with our forum to form a what you can call a new paradigm, which is something which is also beyond political parties and political borders, and which tries to reestablish new guidelines for policymaking and for society. And I'm wondering that that's something we may perhaps continue, because we want to put a focus on all these issues, on narratives and these things in next year or in some month. So maybe come back to this, because I think that's extremely interesting to listen to neuroscience and people like this. Also to know if that's also a kind of forming a group. I mean, it's a very big group. I mean, if you try to form a new paradigm that's guiding the society, then it's about a very big group. I mean, but it's maybe the point to make people think that they are part of something which is working. I mean, it's a common idea of how society works and so on. And that's something we have probably lost. Martin Havik, you have another question or remark?
A remark. We tend to take this discussion too exclusively in terms of people thinking about their jobs and their well-being that way. Speaking from the perspective of the German experience, I think we should not lose sight of people who live on capital income. If we're talking about sources of anger, I think a major source of anger in the case of Germany comes from people who've found their interest income dwindle, being sort of cut cut by 90% or more, which is basically the middle and upper middle classes, those who actually have savings, but who are not rich enough or daring enough to go into the stock market on a big scale or into real estate on a big scale. Much of the anger in sort of part of the German population against the ECB and in the media supporting that are being consumed by this part of the German population against the ECB has a lot to do with that. And of course, the standard argument is, I think Marc was saying, we have negative real interest rates all over the world. We may have negative real interest rates all over the world, but the ones we have in Germany have a culprit in the form of the ECB. And the ECB is just acting as the servant of the Southern Europeans who are out to get the German upper middle class. We may laugh at this, but I think that kind of thinking is a very serious political, and if I may look to Karlsruhe, legal concern in the dynamics of this development. And I'm reasonably sure that among the people demonstrating in Berlin last weekend, there were also people would be quite outspoken about the ECB if they had been asked to do that. So we shouldn't just think about this in terms of sort of labor-related interests. It's also other economic interests. And they provide for significant tribalism as well. And of course, when we then talk about look at the discourse among economists on such matters, we recognize even more tribalisms.
all true. I mean, you know, this is the bit where we need to invoke a thing called reality, however, because basically,
I thought you were going to say dual interest rates.
No, you can go for that. No, I'm just going with simple reality. I mean, basically, there's a lot of work now that basically shows that the 1970s were this period because of inflation of abnormally low rates, and then when you disinflated, which happened much faster than people thought, you ended up with abnormally high rates. So basically, this generation, the baby boomer generation, essentially, came in right at the sweet spot where you got 9% real for showing up at the Sparkasse. And then they began to think they had a God-given right for 4% real for the rest of eternity, and it's just not true. So the fact that it's happening everywhere suggests that it's not just the ECB. Now, the Fed and the ECB have cut rates and basically enabled an enormous amount of corporate misbehavior and created zombie companies, and it hasn't helped. You can totally go with all of that. But, you know, the sort of the I deserve a better interest income thing, you know, I always like to say, I deserve better relationships in my 20s, but it didn't happen, you know, so there we go.
If I just really quickly, I mean, I think it'd be very interesting because effectively a particular interest is then converted into a tribal argument. And I think it was to Catherine's point that then, of course, it's quite nice to be able to blame the low interest income on Southern Europeans rather than, say, fiscal policy. But actually, I think there is a deeper point here, which is that it's a very odd way to stimulate an economy by cutting people's interest income. And it goes back to the fact that we actually haven't had any new ideas. And I think this is very important, the extent to which it's a failure of the mind. And I do not think monetary policy would look anything like it does if we were designing it with a blank sheet of paper, as opposed to just trying to adapt a 18th century institutional structure to a vast set of current economic needs. So, and just to point to one of the wonkier parts of the book, one of our proposals is in fact that you simultaneously raise deposit rates and reduce lending rates through a system of dual interest rates, which is effectively actually what the ECB has done during this crisis. So I have more sympathy. In fact, I have a lot of sympathy. I'd like to get the support of all of those German savers for the proposals in the book, so that we can run with dual interest rates at the ECB. And I'm looking forward to the German Constitutional Court saying this is a fantastic new development in monetary policy.
Yeah.
As ever, Eric has the better answer than I do, which is usually.
That's not true. That's not true. Mark, we can write an editorial on it in the German papers. Let's do it.
Exactly.
Yeah,
I think Richard wants in. Hello, Richard.
Richard.
Yeah.
Hello.
He froze. The moment he clicked this audio, he froze.
Okay.
Me?
I just.
Oh, is he there? No.
Nope.
Still frozen.
Maybe until he's back. I just wanted to finish. I wanted to ask you both to tell us what is the single most important measure that you would favor to both. One, to reduce angriness among people. But Richard is back, I think, before you, so you can reflect on it until.
You back, Richard?
Richard?
No, he's frozen again. His internet.
Okay, so start. I mean, Marc.
All right, Eric, you want to go first?
I mean, it depends whether one wants to be very specific or very general. Why don't I do something very specific, and then Marc can talk more generally about how to tackle anger. I think asset ownership is something that we have struggled with as particular, but probably throughout modern industrial organization. We still haven't found a good balance. And I think our economies are deeply out of balance in terms of the concentration of wealth. And I think our ideas around national wealth funds, which I can very, very briefly describe, is effectively that for countries who don't have oil reserves, I think we should use our balance sheet. So with a combination of a small amount of equity and a large amount of debt, I think governments should be borrowing to set up national wealth funds, and they can then effectively outsource to a third party, set up a proper institutional structure, effectively replicate the sovereign wealth fund of Norway. It's a little known fact that most of the assets, a majority of assets now in the Norwegian sovereign wealth fund have actually been generated by returns and not from the endowment from oil. And that's really, really important. If you can borrow at negative real interest rates, as most of the developed world can, for 20 or 30 years, there is absolutely no reason you can't buy a global diversified group of assets to generate you something like a 4 to 6% real return, which would actually be slightly less than the Norwegians have managed. On a 15 or 20-year view, you can repay the debt and you have the assets. And then you can distribute the ownership of those assets to people who don't have any. I think that is something that could be done across the developed world within 6 months. You could give people a sense of ownership, a stake in the economy, something that's material and that is of significance to them. And that would be, if I could be in government for 12 months, that is what I would set up, because I haven't heard any, you can't, unless you don't believe in arithmetic, you're a supporter of this policy.
And as someone who's never believed in arithmetic, okay, so my closing comment, how about this? I want to bring back Hannah Arendt, because Hannah Arendt basically reminds us of something that we forgot in the 1990s. Politics is not about means, it's about ends. And it is perfectly legitimate to disagree on ends. And what we've forgotten through both, if you will, the technocratization of politics that happened in the 90s and into the 2000s, that everything's fine, all we need to do is find our star and everything will work, the central banking equivalent. Or public policy, it's great, we have an RCT, we've scored them all, we know how to do this intervention, which is a series of moves which basically turns the wants and desires of your fellow citizens into pathologies to be managed by technocrats, which is absolutely toxic for democracy. So I want us to bring back argument. I want us to bring back a full discussion of ends and do that in such a way that we're able to do it without blowing up the system. How do you do that? I actually look to the Danes for inspiration, because what they have done with their climate law is to say that here's the targets we're going for. And it doesn't matter if you're left, right, center, green, blue, whatever. When you're in an election, you don't get to change those targets. This is it. And what they've done by doing that is to change the furniture in the room. Everyone now has to take this on board and work with it. You can do it from your angle, you can do it from your angle, but we are heading in this way. So we need two things. First, a discussion about those ends and what Eric has been articulating, recessions, green transition, etc. Those should be the ends that we need to fight over and fight for. And then when you do that, you put things in the room like a citizens' wealth fund, like a mandate for investment through dual interest rates, like helicopter money in recessions rather than farting around with quantitative easing and the like, that really change the dynamics of politics. And if we think about it in that way, I think it's both a challenge, but it's actually a worthy challenge. Because if at the end of the day, what the technocratic center has to offer working class people across the OECD is to treat them as pathologies to be nudged into better behaviors, then it's already over. We need to change that. We need to respect our fellow citizens again and actually listen to what they're saying.
Thanks very much. I saw that Richard has changed his account, I think. Are you there now?
No audio?
Maybe now it's better?
Yeah, got you.
Okay, yeah, sorry for my connection problems. Yeah, I didn't want to interrupt your conclusion. I just like the idea that this anger is not directed towards finance, because finance is so opaque. And I think many people realize central banks are printing a lot of money somehow, and I don't really benefit from it. So which dimensions of finance should we explain better or communicate more to target a wider audience and to kind of use this anger in a better way? Is it something around money creation, or how pension assets do not really invest in the real economy but boost asset prices? Or maybe it's probably something MMT benefits from this vacuum. They push this argument about deficits and the central bank as a money creator. Or should we promote dual interest rates as the most important solution to this wider audience?
Eric, you work in finance. What would you pull the veil away from? You need to put your microphone on again.
Unsurprisingly, finance is something I've thought a little bit about. Maybe not that unsurprising. But one of its mysteries, I think, is how its benefits kind of go unnoticed. And when something goes wrong, it becomes crystal clear. We only really become enlightened about finance when something goes really badly wrong. It's also something that is extraordinarily difficult to explain. I think, you can explain, actually maybe children are more open to understanding it, because the idea that you can just create stuff out of thin air, they kind of get, Reasonable adults don't like to believe that one of the most fundamental institutions and the basis of our society is just somebody creating some numbers on a computer. That's very disorienting to the serious person. I think the most important thing we can do is illustrate to people how finance can work for them. There's some great efforts by some not-for-profit organizations to try and improve education in finance. I'm all in favor of that, but I think that's an uphill struggle. But I think we need to show how it can work for people. And that's why I think ideas like a national wealth fund, or indeed income support for households, which is the Czech central bank idea, which we've also advocated about central banks giving direct support to household incomes during recessions. People understand that. If the European Central Bank directly targeted individuals' bank accounts during the pandemic or in the next 12 to 18 months, that would create a sense of European solidarity unlike anything else that's occurred within the Eurozone. So I would like finance to be shown to work for people.
Yeah. Very good to finish. There's one last question that's really intriguing. That's in my mind. It's one of the most important parts of the book that I read. That's just at the beginning. Marc, you acknowledged that your wife's steadfast refusal to engage with anything that you write. And you expressed the hope that, or perhaps this book may prove the exception. Does it?
It did. I guilted her into reading it by writing that. That was essentially the purpose of that. It was an admonition to make her do this. And then she did. And then she said to me, okay, I've read it. Now what? I heard all that shit before.
Okay. Very good to know. Now I'm reassured. So thanks to both of you. I think we will. I mean, both or one of you come back to some of these discussions, and certainly about one part of your maybe answers on fiscal policy when we are doing our next workshop in end of September, where you will join, or at least Eric. I don't know exactly if Marc you will be able to join for time reasons, but there we can come back to some of the ideas that you're discussing in the book, and we will discuss the new paradigm of fiscal policy that Jens Südekom and Michael Hüter have prepared as a paper for us. So that's the workshop we will have, and we will see you back then, hopefully. So many thanks to both of you, and have a good day, Marc. You're just starting, is it?
Just starting. I have an hour, and then I have a PhD workshop online.
Okay.
So all the fun
Very
stuff.
good. And thanks, Eric, to London, and to all of you.
Thank you, Thomas.
And having contributed to the discussion. So see you back soon. Maybe tomorrow, if you want to join. Tora has just made the announcement.
Yes, I saw that. I'll definitely come on for that one. That should be fun.
Yeah, it's a good time for you at 5 p.m. our time for Matt in California. Thanks a lot, and
Thank
see
you
you
very much.
Okay.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thanks.
Thanks everyone.
you.
Bye. Thank you, guys.
Take care.